Hey folks, thanks for watching. It's Tuesday morning, June 24th, and it's hot for much of the eastern, maybe half of the country here. I'm recording this about 6 a.m. Central Time. So we're going to update these with the latest values here for some of these temperature readings. I mean, it's at 6 a.m. You're already talking about mid-70s, seeing 80 degree Fahrenheit in St. Louis over in the eastern seaboard. Already up in the low to mid-80s here. It's just brutal heat settling in already just after sunrise here. And I kind of want to focus in on this area, some of the larger population centers, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, because the high temperatures today under these extreme heat warnings are, for lack of a better word, going to be on the extreme side. 102 degree Fahrenheit forecast for Boston from this ECMWF. If you look closely, there is 105 on this map. I don't think we're going to get that hot in New York, but certainly 101, 102 is possible. And this stretches all the way through Philadelphia, triple digits, Baltimore, near 100, DC, 101. I mean, this is a heavily populated area of the country. And at one time, today, this afternoon, you could be talking about 40 to 50 million people experiencing, 100 degree Fahrenheit temperatures, at least outside. So impressive heat continues today for this area. So, stay hydrated, check on your vulnerable neighbors today. Again, those extreme heat warnings are posted all along kind of the mid-Atlantic and then up into New England. Heat advisories continuing today for the Midwest, where temperatures will remain in the mid to high 90s in some of these areas. Get to the further west kind of edge of this, maybe the mid to low 90s. So slowly kind of backing off the heat in the central part of the country as it settles in more so in the eastern part. And again, just kind of that corridor of triple digit temperatures in here runs across, maybe the most heavily populated area of the U.S. So again, a wide area of folks here looking at some brutal temperatures today, frankly. Now, the reason for this, it's something we talked about all week. It's this upper level ridge that's been kind of meandering across the country, and it's pretty dominant even here today. So it was at one time we were calling it kind of a Nashville ridge. It was further west earlier over the weekend. But here maybe more of kind of a Winston-Salem, North Carolina ridge. And you can see that clockwise flow around it, indicative of one of these stronger upper level ridges. And as a result of that, the ridge riding thunderstorm activity has been over here, kind of a frontal line here, if you will, over portions of Iowa, Wisconsin. We saw some severe reports yesterday along that corridor there. And again, if you just kind of follow the flow here, it can kind of tell you where we're likely to see this activity again today. So over New Mexico, over the central part of the country, over maybe up into the Midwest. So when we look at the precipitation pattern in just a minute, you'll see it consistent with that. We even just jump over and look at the water vapor satellite imagery here. You can see, again, all that kind of the debris from yesterday's thunderstorms positioned over here west. Underneath that ridge, you can see how dominant it is, those drier yellow colors on the water vapor loop. Not a tremendous amount of storm reports yesterday. It's just from the Storm Prediction Center. See Wisconsin, quite a few wind reports in the central part of the state, but otherwise relatively quiet across much of the rest of the continental U.S. If we look at the last 24 hours of precipitation, again, right along that kind of front, on the edge of that high pressure system, you can see that focus for thunderstorm development and then precipitation as a result of that. If we just look at the current winds here today, again, underneath that ridge, you're going to see calm to light winds. But southerly winds out of Texas into Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, northerly winds, Iowa, Nebraska. You can kind of see this area of organization in between where we'd probably expect additional thunderstorm development today. A lot of times you can just look at this and say, where's the best kind of return flow out of the Gulf? So where do we have the kind of the best trajectories, if you will? Where does it look like this Gulf moisture is colliding with something? And I would say, man, if you follow this in here, say maybe this area here, you can also see some of this upslope flow in Nebraska here pushing up into the Continental Divide. So, maybe two areas of focus here. When we jump over and look at the areas of concern today from the Storm Prediction Center, well, they highlight that area in western Nebraska, just east of the Continental Divide. And then the excessive rainfall outlook for today on Tuesday is below that. You can see that moderate risk for flooding out for New Mexico. So you can kind of follow those streamlines and show us where we're going to expect storms today. But the front, remember, lingering all the way across the I-80 corridor. So potentially overnight seeing more rainfall here. That's slight risk for excessive rainfall. That Storm Prediction Center risk tomorrow extending across a similar corridor. Might even have a Carolina or a southeast severe event to talk about underneath the ridge as that kind of breaks down and lays over. We'll talk about that in a minute in this video. But again, that excessive rainfall outlook continues tomorrow. Again, the I-80 corridor, maybe a little bit further north up in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then more so on Thursday as well. If we just look at the 3-kilometer NAM forecast to highlight some of that activity, there's some of the weak overnight showers here this morning. So take this forecast into today, expecting potential severe development, eastern Wyoming, Front Range of Colorado, and then more flash flooding risks across New Mexico. But overnight, this is now 9 p.m. Central, seeing some storms get into eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, spreading over this area into southern Minnesota, much of the state of Iowa now, pushing all the way into Nebraska here. Some of those storms from earlier in the afternoon. Talking the early morning hours, wider coverage, the excessive rainfall outlook, that slight risk. You're seeing the reason for it now as we get into Wednesday morning. And then potential renewed development along that front as well. Now this is getting into Wednesday evening. I'll take this back just a few clicks. This is now 5 p.m. Wednesday evening. See potential severe development that we're watching in the Carolinas tomorrow as well. As this wedge kind of weakens, seeing it flatten out a bit. So some of the storms kind of encroaching this way and then underneath it as well. So it's not this big dominant ridge like it was. It's starting to flatten out a bit as it weakens. Some of the storms and coverage is getting better, each kind of flank of it, if you will. Kind of see this from the ECMWF precipitation forecast as well, rather than the 3-kilometer NAM. So if we take it to this afternoon, you can see that coverage over New Mexico, high plains extending off into Iowa, northern Illinois. So take this into the overnight Wednesday morning, see that activity increasing over the upper Midwest. And then in tomorrow afternoon, potential severe storm development over the Carolinas and the Southeast, but that storm activity continuing, even getting into the eastern Corn Belt now. Again, that kind of flattening of the ridge, if you will. Less this and more this. And that's allowing this area to fill in with precipitation. Seeing that continue on Thursday afternoon. Again, that same corridor here, sounding like a broken record, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, portions of eastern Nebraska, northeast Kansas, and then filling in the southeast and the mid-Atlantic as well, continuing some of the rain in the southern plains. Continuing Friday, and then Saturday as well. So this area just filling in underneath that ridge as that ridge weakens and even starts to move out of the area. We're just going to sum this up and look at the latest ECMWF 7-day precipitation total forecast. See that area where I sounded like a broken record there across that I-80 corridor. This was an area of the country we were worried about drought developing in spring and early summer. One of the only areas across kind of what we'll call the central portion of the country that was really developing drought classifications for a time. This is going to remove a lot of that concern. See that activity over New Mexico, and then again, that thunderstorm activity filling in underneath that ridge as it weakens. Even the central and eastern Corn Belt, looking at healthy precipitation chances through the week. Some of these areas are likely to miss out. That's always the case when you see these kind of spottier numbers here. But again, if we get that inch in here after the heat, I don't think that's a bad thing at this point. WPC forecast, rather than the ECMWF, is a little bit more muted, maybe more focused on Iowa and Minnesota, but you can see some precipitation holes in here: Arkansas, southern Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas. But again, underneath where that ridge is today on Tuesday, you're seeing that activity fill in across the southeast, seeing some of this activity get into the central and the eastern Corn Belt as we go through the week. If we jump over and look at the just the 7-day precip anomalies rather than the flat 7-day total forecast from the ECMWF, it does highlight this area. We talked about this drier area in the southern Mississippi River Valley, the southern plains. There is kind of, as we go through the forecast, these kind of cutoff lows that are sneaking underneath what was this more dominant ridge. So I'm not as concerned about this area kind of long term, but it is showing up here in the 7-day precipitation anomalies. We're also seeing areas of the Canadian Prairie, which were wet here over the weekend, starting to go dry as we go further out in the forecast. This may be the other area that we'll have to watch as we get further into this forecast. I'm taking this ECMWF forecast out to a 4 to 10 day anomaly, so trying to remove this week. And what we're seeing here is this ridge flattens, weakens, and moves out of the picture. More of that flow gets in here across the southeast, the Midwest, the southern plains. So seeing precipitation chances continue here as we get into next weekend, where it's going over dry portions of the Northwest, the Canadian Prairie, save for some scattered storms. You're talking about Alberta, Saskatchewan, and then even the northern plains, maybe the upper Midwest a little bit as well. So keeping an eye on this area because of that longer range, maybe dry concern there in the month of July. We're seeing that shift over perhaps in the first few days of July, something to keep an eye on here. The reason for that, if we look at the 500 millibar height forecast from the ECMWF, I talked about this ridge flattening out and weakening. So we're going to see that over the next few days. I'm going to take this out quickly: Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, now all the way into Friday. And that ridge now has weakened quite a bit. You can still kind of maybe see a weak remnant of it still across the eastern U.S. Getting some of these kind of little cutoff flows underneath it. We'll have to keep an eye on some of these as they just kind of linger in the area, bringing precipitation chances to the southern high plains in the southeast. So take this forecast into Saturday, now the weekend, Sunday. What was a ridge here Tuesday morning has been replaced with weak troughing across the eastern U.S., and we're starting to see ridging now build back in to the northwest. And this was some of that concern going into July from some of the long-range forecasts that there was support for this ridging here in the first week of the month. And at least from that ECMWF operational, we're seeing some of that both starting in the northwest and then pushing out into the northern plains as we get further into next week. We see that as well from the ECMWF ensemble rather than the operational run. Again, just Wednesday, July 2nd of next week. Decent agreement here in some of the models of generally ridging across the northwest, troughing across the east, and then some of these kind of cutoff lows underneath, which is likely going to keep some precipitation here. If you remember that conversation I had earlier in June about these kind of quote-unquote quietly dry Julys for the central part of the country, we often saw some of these cutoff lows here blocking some of that return flow from getting back into the Midwest. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen for the next 30 days, but it is a signature I'm going to keep an eye on as it's kind of lingers in the forecast here. Look at the ECMWF ensemble 8 to 14 day precipitation anomaly. This is now the first week of July here. You can see it highlighting that drier concern for the Canadian Prairie, the Northern Plains, maybe the upper Midwest portions of northern Wisconsin and Minnesota. Underneath that, with these kind of cutoff lows lingering with better flow and this troughing moving through the eastern part of the country, seeing better precipitation chances here over the central and southern plains. We'll keep an eye on that dry area here over East Texas, western Louisiana. But by and large, this area here looking at healthy precipitation chances through the next 10 to 14 days. The heat, as you might imagine, getting out into that first week of July, shifting more over the northwest under the presence of that upper level ridge, with just that weak troughing over the eastern U.S., not expecting, quote unquote, cooler temperatures, but definitely more on the seasonal summer side and less so. I'm talking about a string of 100-degree Fahrenheit forecasts up the eastern seaboard. And then the cooler temperatures you're seeing here over the southern high plains, that's precipitation induced. So with that ridge up here, it's pulling some of that moisture in here with those cutoff lows. You can kind of see that same signature over Florida. And this just tells me you got to have an amplified pattern here with these lingering lows underneath it and the heat staying more toward the northwest. I did want to look at the AIFS. It's, again, this year it's performing a little bit better in that kind of 10 to 15 day range. So looking for a signal there. I'm taking this ridge trough ridge forecast out a little bit into this week. So now Thursday, June 22nd. You can see what I mean by that ridge flattening out a bit with that flow coming across the northern to the eastern Corn Belt and sneaking underneath that with that cutoff flow here over Florida. That's bringing the precipitation chances filling in on kind of each side of it here this week. See that weakening, kind of getting out of the picture here as we go through the day on Saturday. Now into early next week, Monday, Tuesday, there's that ridging across the northwest that we saw in the ensemble from the ECMWF and the operational, seeing it on the AFS here, seeing some of these kind of weak troughing underneath that. I'm talking Thursday, well out. This is, getting well out into the forecast, kind of the 10 to 15 day mark at this point. But generally seeing kind of weak ridging here across the northwest, and even kind of overspreading the central U.S. at times. So at least that northwest to maybe northern plains dry concern is consistent, I would say, with the AIFS forecast here this morning. And then the reason I think that, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. There we go. The reason I think we're talking about some of those cutoff lows here is this ridge was so dominant, positioned here today on Tuesday, the 24th, that you're seeing this kind of easterly flow, kind of clockwise flow on the southern side of it, and that's pulling down some of these little kind of troughs. I don't know if you can kind of see these here. There's a little spin up there, a little spin up here. We actually have a little kind of vorticity maximum here. Another one of these is positioned down here over Mexico. So you can kind of follow the wind here, these high level clouds. See them kind of out of the north here over western Mexico, now out of the west here over southern Mexico, and now pushing northeast up over the Bay of Campeche. So you have this lingering trough here. You have another one entering the picture here underneath the ridge. As this flattens out, this is going to kind of sneak around Florida in the southeast. This one here is going to be lingering all the while. So as we build the heat up into here to the northwest, these are going to be lingering around here. And I think these are going to complicate the forecast, frankly. They're going to have some access to Gulf moisture, some thunderstorms. Talked about the potential for excessive rain in New Mexico, across the southeast perhaps throughout the 10 to 14 day forecast. And these are never well modeled in the long range, and I think it's just going to add to more forecast uncertainty in July. And it does kind of pose that risk of those quote-unquote quietly dry Julys where, our ridging stayed off toward the northwest. We'd expect ridge-riding thunderstorms maybe over the Midwest, the Corn Belt, the soybean belt. But if these troughs linger in this area here, they kind of steal some of that moisture on its way north. And it maybe wouldn't be the best news for folks here who are trying to get less rain rather than more of it. But nonetheless, keep an eye on that in the forecast as we go forward. Did want to mention briefly, I'm still looking at a 40% chance that we get our first named storm in the Atlantic, but Outside of being maybe a alphabetical milestone, it's not really going to be relevant. This is a very weak system here east of Bermuda, well out into the Atlantic. Seeing more proper development chances here over the eastern Pacific. Again, we've had a busy year over here east and, I should say, south and west of Mexico. In the eastern Pacific, this one up to 70% chance of development from the National Hurricane Center. Neither of these a large threat to land at this point for the United States. This one is it's a little bit curious because we've been talking about the Bermuda High position as we do every summer, and this one kind of positioned near Bermuda. If we just jump over and look at the surface level winds across Bermuda High, it's kind of in this weak, let's call it a saddle point between the Azores High here. Here's the Azores, west of Spain. You can see that clockwise spinning around it. And then this kind of more proper Bermuda High, which is spinning here over, quote unquote, Bermuda. But it is kind of lending to maybe a split Bermuda High a bit, where you have kind of one section of it here, and it's gotten so far west, right? It's starting to push in those warm temperatures into the eastern U.S., and then one section of it over here. And if this stays split, and this one's kind of lingering over in this area, it can sometimes get too far into the U.S., and that can bring drought to the southeast. We've seen some of that signal on some of the forecasts here over portions of the southeast, and if this one splits and goes way over by Ireland, we get even more concerned for ridging developing over the central part of the country. So I just said, this isn't a threat to land, but it is indicative of this kind of saddle point between the two highs. You can kind of see that here, this low pressure trough and this potential extra tropical storm kind of developing along it. I did want to look out a little bit further into July here near the end of this video. Let's see how much time I have left. Plenty of time for this. All right, so earlier this June, when I was thinking about where we were watching kind of MJO phases for later in the month of July, we did kind of note that looking out into that second and third, maybe fourth week of July, that we wanted to watch out for phases 1, 2, and 3. And the reason for that was phase 1, phase 2, ridging over the Midwest, and phase 3, ridging over the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Corn Belt. Now, fortunately, the forecast right now, as we look into the first part of July, at least from the ECMWF here, zoom that in, we see MJO not moving around much, really kind of in null space. No kind of major signal to be in 1, 2, or 3 at this point. And then if we look at some of these extended forecasts from the GFS, better chances right now as we get further into the month of July that we're in either phase 4, 5, or 6. Again, the MJO not a huge signal at this time of the year, but with as certain as the forecast is, we'll take kind of any signal that we can get at this point. And if we look at those same phases, so rather than being as concerned about maybe phase 1, 2, and 3 for some Midwest ridging in the second and third week of July, if we look at phases 4, 5, actually see troughing over the portions of the Midwest, 6, better signal for troughing. If we get all the way into phase 6, kind of the middle to late part of July, and then this ridging over the Northwest. So I found that to be a little bit curious with that Climate Prediction Center forecast warmer and drier in this area, kind of more troughing in the eastern U.S., more so a phase 5, 6, maybe even 7 phenomenon. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on these MJO forecasts. You can kind of see this contour here, showing more of the members as we get out into July, trying to make that trek for phase 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 at the end of July. Again, MJO not a huge signal in this part of the calendar, but it is something to keep an eye on given kind of the historical analogs here. I did want to jump over. This was speaking of those analogs, 2006 has come up a few times this year. We talked about this in spring a bit. I'm kind of returning to it now because at least if you look at the precipitation signal in July from that year, we were drier across portions of the upper Midwest and northern plains. We were also, frankly, drier across portions of the southeast. So I talked about that maybe split Bermuda High can push its influence closer to the eastern seaboard, maybe even into the southeast at times. That's perhaps something to keep an eye on. We even see maybe from 2006 a signal of some of those cutoff lows over portions of the southeast. If we look at temperatures for that year, more so that heat dominated across the Northwest, with perhaps some troughing across the eastern U.S. If we just jump over and look at the 500 millibar height pattern for July of 2006, large ridge across the Northwest, not necessarily troughing across the eastern U.S., but definitely less ridging. You can see this deep trough south of Alaska. So I'm not saying this is what this year is going to look like, but that 2006 analog kind of hanging around in my head here this morning as I think about where we're going in July, at least a scenario that's maybe consistent with some of these long-range or seasonal forecasts for the whole month of July at this point. There's some differences here. If we look at the sea surface temperatures now, you can see these cool waters here, this indicative of this negative PMM, the kind of weak remnant La Nina here across the eastern Pacific. And if I jump over and compare that to 2006 for roughly the same date here, near the end of June, well, we have the cooler waters here. We have that kind of remnant La Nina signature, but look at the Gulf of Alaska. Look at how much colder in 2006 we were compared to this year in this area here. So that deep trough in that 2006 500 millibar composite might not be as reliable this year. And it was definitely that trough that allowed this ridging to build and be so persistent in 2006. So while it is something in the back of my mind to keep an eye on, those kind of warm waters here that we're seeing this year push into the Northeast Pacific are really throwing a wrench into that kind of evolving drought conversation that we've talked about this year. If we look further into the forecast here, I did want to touch on the ECMWF weeklies. I brought these up in almost every video this year. The latest forecasts here, even early this week, are still dry for the series here in the Northwest. I mentioned the various kind of signals in the forecast, both kind of analogs, the Climate Prediction Center, even the early ensembles in early July, and then the extended weeklies for warmer and drier across the Northwest, the Canadian Prairie, the Northern Plains. That has continued in the ECMWF extended weeklies. And what I'm going to do here, because I've been showing these every day, I'm actually going to compare them. I'm going to compare the trend of this forecast. So this is a 30-day precipitation anomaly forecast for the entire month of July. And we're just going to let it show us the last X amount of runs of this. I think it takes us out maybe 10 runs. And each one is getting, there just restarted, each one is getting closer to the current date, or the most latent or valid run, if you will. And what I'm seeing is earlier in the cycle, we saw more of the dry signal here over the central and southern plains, right? It's the highest values for negative precipitation anomalies for the month of July. But as this forecast has gone on, we've seen these weaken over the central plains and maybe shift toward the northwest. You can see that there. So again, more so of a signal that we're seeing that dry and concerned build in more so over the northwest than maybe the central or the southern plains. If we do the same thing for heat, let's take this out, compare the runs. You can see just at the end there, so less contours over the central, the southern plains, more so maybe pushing over the northwest. And if we just kind of look at soil moisture deficits here, the morning of June 24th, I'll refresh this. We've been talking about this I-80 corridor, but remember at the beginning of this video, look at all the rainfall expected over this area here. So less and less concerned about this area, pushing in here, and really the only other remaining areas of soil moisture deficits are in the western U.S. and maybe the southeast. So thinking about where the ridge is most likely to set up in July, I have to give more kind of credence to maybe the northwest or the interior west of the U.S. rather than maybe the Midwest or central part of the country. And then with that split Bermuda high, I'm not going to stop thinking about the southeast here. So some of these soil moisture deficits, this is an area that's going to be wet here over the next 7 days, but that Bermuda high can be dominant at times. We're seeing that here today, obviously. So still kind of lingering drought thoughts in my brain for the southeast portions of Florida, the coastal plain here, with some of the historical analogs that we're watching. I'll leave it there today. Andrew Pritchard will be with you all tomorrow morning. For those of you who made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching.